Welcome to Miss Scarlett. Subscribe and don't miss out on Patreon. Have fun!
A room stifles, even one littered with the remnants of a dream. Lucas knows that better than anyone as he stands, brush poised, lifeless above a blank canvas. His fingers tremble, the energy spent fueling his myriad works sapping his nerves. Auburn hair, a mess as always, falls across eyes that roam the room for artistic inspiration. This place is a tomb built of canvas, each one a silent witness to Lucas's talent and passion. A talent and passion that has only ever spoken to one person. The Harmony Gallery, one of the most prestigious in the city, was hosting an exhibition dedicated to emerging female talent. Lucas sighed, tossing his brush aside. Another opportunity he couldn't grasp. Another door closed before he could even knock. He slumped onto his worn couch, burying his face in his hands.
"There has to be a way,"
he muttered, his voice muffled against his palms. "I can't keep living like this." His gaze fell on a half-finished portrait propped against the wall. It was a self-portrait, but not quite. In it, Lucas had painted himself as he sometimes imagined. Softer features, longer hair, a delicate grace to the brushstrokes. It was a side of himself he'd never dared to explore beyond the safety of his canvases. A wild idea began to take root in his mind. It was crazy, unethical even. But as he looked around at the unsold paintings cluttering his tiny apartment, desperation overrode his reservations. "What if?" he whispered, the plan unfolding in his mind. "What if Lucia submitted those paintings?" The next morning, Lucas found himself standing before the mirror, heart pounding. He'd spent hours scouring thrift stores and borrowing clothes from his neighbor, assembling an outfit that would transform him into Lucia. He slipped on a flowing blue dress, the fabric cool against his skin. With trembling hands, he applied makeup, following tutorials he'd frantically watched the night before. A long auburn wig, carefully styled, completed the transformation. Lucia, stared at her reflection, barely recognizing the person looking back. She was beautiful, in an unconventional way, with a vulnerability in her eyes that seemed to speak volumes. "Hello, Lucia," she whispered, her voice soft and uncertain. "It's time to make your debut." Gathering her courage, Lucia carefully packed up her best paintings and made her way to the Harmony Gallery. Each step in the unfamiliar heels was a challenge, but she forced herself to walk with confidence she didn't feel. The gallery was bustling with activity when she arrived. Artists of all ages milled about, their work tucked under their arms or rolled up in tubes. Lucia took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "Welcome to Harmony Gallery," a cheerful receptionist greeted her. "Are you here for the open call?" Lucia nodded, not trusting her voice. She handed over her portfolio with shaking hands, praying the receptionist wouldn't see through her disguise. "Wonderful! And your name?" "Lucia," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lucia Reeves." The receptionist smiled, jotting down the name. "Beautiful name. We'll be in touch within the week, Lucia. Best of luck." As Lucia turned to leave, she caught sight of herself in a mirror. For a moment, she saw Lucas staring back, wide-eyed and terrified. But then Lucia's image solidified, and with it came a strange sense of rightness. The week that followed was agonizing. Lucas alternated between hope and despair, convinced that his deception would be discovered at any moment. He threw himself into his art, creating piece after piece as Lucia's style began to emerge, softer, more emotive, yet with an underlying strength that surprised him. When the call finally came, Lucas almost let it go to voicemail, but at the last second, he answered, his heart in his throat.
"Is this Lucia Reeves?"
A crisp voice asked.
"Yes, this is she,"
Lucas replied, pitching his voice higher.
"Ms. Reeves, we're thrilled to inform you that your work has been selected for the upcoming exhibition. Your unique perspective and emotional depth truly stood out. We'd love to feature 3 of your pieces."
Lucas nearly dropped the phone, overwhelmed by a mixture of elation and guilt.
"Thank you,"
he managed to say.
"I'm honored."
As he hung up, Lucas caught sight of himself in the mirror. For a moment, he saw Lucia staring back, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. The night of the exhibition arrived all too quickly. Lucas spent hours transforming himself into Lucia, each brush stroke of makeup feeling like another lie. Yet as she stepped into the gallery, there was an undeniable thrill. Lucia's paintings hung on the pristine white walls, bathed in soft lighting that made them glow. People clustered around them, discussing the techniques, the emotions they evoked. For the first time, Lucas saw his work through others' eyes, and it was intoxicating.
"Ah, there you are!"
A voice called out. Lucia turned to see the gallery owner, Amanda, approaching with a wide smile.
"Lucia, darling, your work is the talk of the evening. Come, let me introduce you to some people."
What followed was a whirlwind of introductions, discussions about art, and more praise than Lucas had ever received in his life. As Lucia, he found himself opening up, discussing his inspirations and techniques with a freedom he'd never experienced before.
"There's such vulnerability in your work,"
one critic commented, gesturing to a painting of a figure caught between 2 worlds.
"Yet also a sense of emerging strength. It's quite remarkable."
Lucia nodded, a lump forming in her throat.
"It's a very personal piece," she admitted. "About finding oneself, I suppose."
As the night wore on, Lucia found herself swept up in the excitement. She laughed, she debated artistic styles, she even accepted a glass of champagne to toast her success. For a few precious hours, the lie didn't matter. She was Lucia, and Lucia was real. It wasn't until she returned home, kicking off the uncomfortable heels and staring at her reflection, makeup smudged, wig askew, that reality came crashing back. Lucas stared at himself in the mirror, the remnants of Lucia slowly fading away.
"What have I done?"
he whispered, the weight of his deception settling heavily on his shoulders. But as weeks passed, Lucas found it increasingly difficult to separate himself from Lucia. Her success opened doors he'd only dreamed of. Galleries clamored for her work, magazines wanted interviews, and for the first time in his life, Lucas was making a living from his art. Each time he transformed into Lucia, it felt less like a disguise and more like revealing a hidden truth. He found himself studying women's mannerisms, practicing his voice, and even considering more permanent changes. One morning, as Lucas prepared for another day as Lucia, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. The face staring back was a blend of Lucas and Lucia, neither fully one nor the other. In that moment, a realization struck him with the force of a thunderbolt.
"I'm not pretending anymore,"
he whispered, touching his reflection.
"This is who I am."
The decision to come out as a transgender artist wasn't an easy one. Lucas, now fully embracing her identity as Lucia, spent weeks agonizing over how to reveal the truth. She feared losing everything she'd gained, but the burden of living a lie had become too heavy to bear. Finally, Lucia decided to let her art speak for her. She poured her heart and soul into a new collection, each piece chronicling her journey from Lucas to Lucia. The centerpiece was a large canvas split down the middle. One side showed Lucas, the other Lucia, with a swirling blend of colors and identities in between. When the exhibition opened, Lucia stood before her guests, heart pounding. She wore a simple green dress, her auburn hair styled in soft waves. Gone was the wig, the exaggerated makeup. This was Lucia, raw and real. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "This collection is more than just art. It's my truth." As Lucia shared her story, she saw a range of emotions play across the faces in the crowd. Surprise, confusion, and yes, some anger. But there was also understanding, empathy, and support. "I never intended to deceive anyone," Lucia explained, her voice growing stronger. "What began as a desperate attempt to have my art seen became a journey of self-discovery. Through Lucia, I found my true self." The room fell silent as Lucia finished speaking. For a moment, she feared she'd lost everything. Then, slowly, someone began to applaud. Others joined in, the sound swelling until it filled the gallery. Amanda, the gallery owner who had first championed Lucia's work, stepped forward. "Your art has always spoken of transformation and self-discovery," she said, taking Lucia's hand. "Now we understand just how personal that journey was. Thank you for your bravery in sharing it with us." In the days that followed, Lucia's story made headlines. There was controversy, of course. Some accused her of fraud, others of exploiting the struggles of women artists. But for every negative voice, there seemed to be two positive ones, praising her courage and the power of her art. Lucia threw herself into her work with renewed passion. Her art evolved, becoming even more personal and evocative. She began to receive invitations to speak at LGBTQ+ events, sharing her story and inspiring others who were struggling with their own identities. One afternoon, as Lucia stood before her easel, brush in hand, she caught sight of her reflection in the studio window. Gone was the uncertainty, the fear of discovery. In its place was a woman comfortable in her own skin, eyes bright with purpose. She turned back to her canvas, adding bold strokes of color to the emerging image. It was a self-portrait, not of Lucas, not of the persona she'd created, but of Lucia as she truly was. Strong, vulnerable, complex, and finally, authentically herself. As she worked, Lucia's mind wandered to the journey that had brought her to this point. The desperate decision that had started it all seemed like a lifetime ago. She remembered the first time she'd stood before a mirror as Lucia, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. Now, as she added the final touches to her painting, Lucia realized that the fear was gone. In its place was a sense of peace, of finally being whole. The next exhibition was a triumph. Lucia's new collection, titled Emergence, drew critics and art lovers from across the country. As she moved through the gallery, dressed in a flowing purple gown that complemented her auburn hair, Lucia felt a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before.
"Your work has taken on a new depth," one critic commented, studying a particularly striking piece.
There's a raw honesty here that's truly compelling. Lucia smiled, running her hand along the frame of the painting. I've finally found my voice, she replied, both as an artist and as a person. As the evening wore on, Lucia found herself drawn to a quiet corner of the gallery. There, hanging slightly apart from the others, was the self-portrait of Lucas she'd painted so long ago. She stood before it, lost in thought.
It's a powerful piece,
a voice said beside her. Lucia turned to see a young woman, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I think I understand it now. Lucia took the woman's hand, squeezing it gently. We all have different parts of ourselves, she said softly. The journey is in learning to embrace them all. As the exhibition came to a close, Lucia found herself surrounded by a small group of admirers. They peppered her with questions about her techniques, her inspirations, and yes, her journey. Do you ever regret it? One person asked. Coming out, I mean. Lucia paused, considering the question carefully. There are moments when it's been difficult, she admitted. But regret? No. Living authentically, being true to myself, it's given my art and my life a purpose I never had before. Later that night, as Lucia prepared for bed, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. She studied her reflection, taking in the soft curves of her face, the way her auburn hair fell around her shoulders. This was Lucia, not a disguise, not a lie, but her truest self. She thought back to that first desperate decision, the fear and excitement of becoming Lucia for the first time. It had been a journey filled with challenges, but one that had led her to a place of self-acceptance and artistic fulfillment she'd never thought possible. As she drifted off to sleep, Lucia's mind was already filled with ideas for her next collection. She had so many stories left to tell, so many emotions to capture on canvas. And now, finally, she had the courage and the freedom to tell them. The sun rose on a new day, streaming through the windows of Lucia's studio apartment. The space, once cluttered and chaotic, now reflected the order she'd found in her life. Paintings lined the walls, each one a testament to her journey and growth. Lucia stood before her easel, brush in hand, ready to begin her next piece. As she mixed her colors, she thought about the path that had led her here. From a struggling artist living a lie to a woman embracing her true self, every step had shaped her into the person and artist she was today. She began to paint, bold strokes bringing her vision to life on the canvas. This piece would be different from her others, a celebration of transformation, of becoming. As she worked, Lucia felt a sense of peace wash over her. She was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The lie that had started it all had become the truth that set her free. Lucia smiled to herself, adding a splash of vibrant color to her painting. Her journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But now, she faced the future not with fear, but with hope and excitement for all that was yet to come. As the day wore on, Lucia lost herself in her work, barely noticing the passage of time. It wasn't until a knock at the door startled her from her creative trance that she realized how late it had gotten. She opened the door to find Amanda, the gallery owner who had become a dear friend and mentor. I hope I'm not interrupting, Amanda said, her eyes twinkling. But I have some news I think you'll want to hear. Lucia ushered her in, curiosity piqued. Amanda's gaze swept over the new paintings, a smile of approval crossing her face. "Your work continues to evolve," she commented.
It's remarkable to see.
"Thank you," Lucia replied, warmth spreading through her at the praise. "But what's this news you mentioned?" Amanda's smile widened. "The Museum of Modern Art is putting together an exhibition on transformative art, pieces that challenge societal norms and push boundaries. They want to feature your work, Lucia. A whole room dedicated to your journey." Lucia felt her knees go weak, and she sank onto a nearby stool. "The MoMA?" she whispered, scarcely able to believe it. "Are you serious?" Amanda nodded, reaching out to squeeze Lucia's hand. "You've touched so many lives with your art and your story, Lucia. This is a chance to reach even more people, to make an even bigger impact." As the reality of the opportunity sank in, Lucia felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation wash over her. This would be her biggest platform yet, a chance to share her journey with the world. But it also meant opening herself up to an even greater level of scrutiny. "It's a big step," Amanda said softly, seeming to read Lucia's thoughts. "But I think you're ready for it." Lucia took a deep breath, looking around at the paintings that surrounded her. Each one represented a piece of her journey, a fragment of the truth she'd discovered about herself. She thought of all the people who had reached out to her after her coming out, telling her how her story had inspired them or given them courage. "You're right," Lucia said, a smile spreading across her face. "I am ready." The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Lucia threw herself into creating new pieces for the exhibition, pushing herself to new artistic heights. She wanted this collection to be her most honest and powerful yet, a true representation of her journey from Lucas to Lucia. As the opening night of the exhibition approached, Lucia found herself reflecting on how far she'd come. She thought of Lucas, that struggling artist who had been so desperate for recognition that he'd been willing to live a lie. She thought of the first time she'd become Lucia, terrified but exhilarated. And she thought of the moment she'd realized that Lucia wasn't a disguise, but her true self. The journey hadn't been easy, but standing in her studio, surrounded by the art that told her story, Lucia knew she wouldn't change a thing. The night of the exhibition opening arrived, and Lucia stood before her mirror, putting the finishing touches on her outfit. She wore a stunning red gown that hugged her curves, her auburn hair styled in elegant waves. As she applied her lipstick, she caught her own gaze in the mirror and smiled. This was Lucia, strong, confident, and ready to share her truth with the world. The museum was packed when she arrived, a buzz of excitement filling the air. As Lucia made her way through the crowd, she overheard snippets of conversation about her work, her story. It was surreal, hearing strangers discuss her journey as if they knew her. Amanda appeared at her side, guiding her towards the room dedicated to her work.
"Are you ready?"
she asked, giving Lucia's hand a reassuring squeeze. Lucia took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "I've been ready for this my whole life," she replied. As they entered the room, Lucia felt her breath catch in her throat. Seeing her paintings displayed in the MoMA, surrounded by the works of artists she'd admired for years, was overwhelming. Each piece told a part of her story, from the early works signed by Lucas, to the first paintings she'd submitted as Lucia, to her most recent creations that fully embraced her identity. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a triptych, 3 large canvases that showed her transformation. The first depicted Lucas, alone and struggling. The second showed the dual identity of Lucas and Lucia, a visual representation of her internal conflict. The third showed Lucia as she was now, confident, authentic, and at peace. As visitors began to fill the room, Lucia found herself drawn into conversations about her work. She spoke openly about her journey, answering questions with a candor that surprised even her. There were difficult moments. Not everyone was supportive or understanding, but for every negative comment, there seemed to be a dozen positive ones. One interaction stood out in particular. A young person, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and nervousness, approached Lucia. "Your art, your story," they began, their voice trembling slightly. "It's given me the courage to be myself. Thank you." Lucia felt tears prick at her eyes as she embraced the young person. In that moment, she knew that all the struggles, all the fear and uncertainty had been worth it. If her journey could help even one person find the courage to be true to themselves, it was all worthwhile. As the night wore on, Lucia found herself standing before her triptych, lost in thought. She felt a presence beside her and turned to see Amanda, a proud smile on her face. "You've come so far," Amanda said softly. "From that first day you walked into my gallery as Lucia, to now. I'm so proud of you." Lucia smiled, linking her arm through Amanda's. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied. "Without all the people who supported me along the way." As they stood there, contemplating the journey depicted on the canvases before them, Lucia felt a sense of completion wash over her. This wasn't an ending, she knew. In many ways, it was just the beginning, but it was a moment to pause, to acknowledge how far she'd come, and to look forward to all that was yet to come. The exhibition was a resounding success. Critics praised Lucia's bravery and the power of her art, and her story reached people around the world. She received countless messages from individuals who saw themselves reflected in her journey, who found hope and courage in her story. In the weeks that followed, Lucia found herself busier than ever. She was invited to speak at art schools, to participate in panel discussions about gender and identity in art. Her work was in higher demand than ever, with collectors and galleries clamoring for her pieces. But through it all, Lucia never lost sight of what truly mattered, the ability to be true to herself and to express that truth through her art. Each time she stood before a blank canvas, brush in hand, she felt a sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this point. One quiet evening, as Lucia sat in her studio working on a new piece, she caught sight of an old photo tucked away on a shelf. It was a picture of Lucas, from before the transformation began. She picked it up, studying the face of the person she used to be. There was sadness in Lucas's eyes, a longing for something he couldn't quite name. Lucia touched the photo gently, feeling a wave of compassion for her past self. "We made it," she whispered. "We found our way." She set the photo back on the shelf and turned to her canvas. With sure strokes, she began to paint, pouring all the joy, pain, fear, and triumph of her journey onto the canvas. This was her gift, her truth, her legacy. And as the first light of dawn began to creep through her studio windows, Lucia smiled, ready to embrace whatever the new day might bring.
Thanks for watching, my girlies! Be sure to check out Patreon for more!